Okay, so welcome to the latest in our series of webinars from Oxford. So we are at the Saïd Business School in Oxford today. The latest in our series focusing on topics around the Oxford Social Finance Programme, which is running in November. So the social finance programme here at Oxford is a unique executive development programme for people who are interested in addressing some of the large-scale challenges around the world as outlined by the UN in the SDGs. So to make any significant progress towards meeting the SDGs in the time frame, then there is a big capital gap. So we look at how we can raise some of that capital and funding by combining money from foundations with grants, with impact investing, with government money and other sources of capital to address projects on that scale. Facilitating the webinar today will be Gayle Peterson, who is the Programme Director for the Social Finance Programme, and she'll be with two of our guest speakers from the November programme, Bruce Lourie, who's the President from the Ivey Foundation, and Jeff Cyr from Raven Indigenous Capital Partners in Canada, talking about low carbon for Canada, the Commonwealth and the Indigenous community. As we go through, we will keep all participants on mute because we will have about 100 people online, so that keeps the sound clear. We do want you to ask any questions. So the way to do that is to enter those into the keypad in front of you. There'll be a questions box, and then after we've heard the presentations from Bruce and Jeff, we'll address those questions. So please enter any questions as we get through. Thank you very much for joining. I'll now hand over to Gayle to introduce our session for today. Thank you, Gayle.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Next slide, please. It's let's change the slide. There we go. It's actually sunny in Oxford today, and quite beautiful. The idea of the Impact Series again is to allow our participants and listeners to really understand what we do in social finance and how we use blended capital to address the world's most complex issues, and really think through who's out there doing remarkable work that we want to bring to the forefront in terms of global debate. You know, it also taps our very rich global network. So with these webinars, we hope to give you some insights into what we're learning, what creativity around use of capital is taking place around the world, and how you can take advantage of that. Next slide. We have developed a nest actually of programs, one in impact investing, which has been going on now for 6 years. Out of that, and our alums have requested a program in social finance that looks at blended capital at scale. So deals that go from not just millions, but billions and trillions. And then also impact measures. How do we know we're making a difference with our creative capital? Next slide. This slide shows you again how we look at impact investing, venture philanthropy, and social finance. And for us, social finance is the larger umbrella that includes and encompasses impact investing and venture philanthropy. So we are looking at de-risking through philanthropy, innovations, R&D, through social enterprise and scale for profit models. Thank you. Next slide. You've got a remarkable group of people today. Bruce was on our first social finance program last year, and Jeff actually attended the program. And so they come with experience, and we're excited about, it's always good to have good colleagues and good friends join us for our webinars. Next slide, please. We look at these, the problems that we address, the world's most complex problems, as wicked problems. Those that have no easy solution. We look at it in the context of deliberate leadership, which are steps and strategies that colleagues that are thought leaders that are taking steps to address the world's most complex issues. And we unravel those and help students come up with a strategy for themselves, for their organizations, and for their network on how to effectively address these issues. Next slide, please. Climate change is one of the biggest. The World Economic Forum has acknowledged climate change as being one of the cornerstones of the world's most complex issues that keeps leaders around the world up at night. It's the interconnection of social, economic, politics, people, place. It drives issues of poverty and inequality. It drives issues of immigration and migration. It drives issues of destruction of biodiversity and the livelihood of our planet. And I think that today's an auspicious day. Two things are happening. One, there's a convening. Bruce is actually in California for a convening of the Global Climate Action Summit, which is actually Governor Jerry Brown has called together leaders from around the world to, as the United States has, Trump administration has decided that climate change doesn't exist. This is an opportunity for global leaders to acknowledge that it does exist and to really talk about strategies to meet the Paris Accord through innovative strategies. In addition, Canada is at the centerpiece of climate. This is also the 10-year anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the beginning of a global crisis, financial crisis. How we address new ways of economic structure and using capital creatively comes with a moral compass too. And we're going to explore that today. So we're going to talk about what's happening that's unique in Canada, both at using capital creatively in the context of deliberate leadership, addressing climate change, and also finding your moral compass at involving communities most at risk in decisions about how capital is used. Canada is important for a number of reasons. It's the second largest country in the world after Russia. It's the fourth largest oil producer and exporter, and it's been identified as one of the top 10 largest greenhouse gas emitters. And the other piece of this is the Arctic North. When permafrost is being destroyed, it's vulnerable for not only Indigenous people but for the world. So what happens in Canada really does shape global climate change policy, the use of capital, and we want to really explore what's happening that's innovative and worth replicating as Canada seeks to be the moral compass for North America and offer some solutions for the world. So with that, next slide, please. The two questions we're going to talk about today is how can sustainable finance strategy impact climate change at a country level, at a continent level, at a global level? What could be learned from Canada's experience? And also, what are the tools for involving Indigenous communities and actually make capital decisions? So we'll follow with Q&A and next steps. But I want to quickly turn it over to Bruce to get us started. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Gayle. And got quite a few things that I'm just going to run through quickly, really just to give us a snapshot of some of the details on those very things that you're describing, Gayle. First of all, in Canada, we have an interesting political context where we have perhaps one of the most progressive climate leaders in the planet today, in our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. But one of the challenges in Canada is a little bit more like Europe than it is like its own country, where the country itself would be like the European Union and the provinces would be like the countries, because each province in Canada actually has its own jurisdiction over energy and environment. So federally, we need the provinces on board, and that's becoming challenging because, like everywhere in the world, we're seeing a rise in populism and a rise in political leaders who, frankly, don't believe in climate change. So we're now in a position of kind of struggling to hang on to what we have, and it's so we're all concerned about that rise of populism. And this is really just for information, so we can skip over this, but basically to say that right now, about 80% of Canadians are living in jurisdictions that have a carbon pricing regime. So it's a big part of our climate solution. Um, when we were doing the program at Oxford last year, we were working with Gayle on describing our work through the lens of deliberate leadership, and it's something that I like very much because it really puts a focus on how we operate. And again, these are really just more to give a bit of a sense of what we're going to be going into in more depth in Oxford, and but just letting you know that these are kind of priorities that we see for the country in terms of how we manage through the climate problem. And so for us, energy efficiency is the most cost-effective and really the easiest way to deal with climate change. It's reducing the use of fuels at the source. And one of the interesting things with with energy efficiency is there are many very creative new social finance mechanisms to help support energy efficiency. Thanks. For us, our deliberate leadership objective is creating the capacity. In many of these, you'll see our goal is to really create new institutional capacity, and we're very pleased that working through a collaborative group that we've set up called the Clean Economy Fund, we've now developed this, or basically revamped an organization that's now called Efficiency Canada, which is a national collaborative of businesses, NGOs, working closely with government on efficiency. One of the things that we saw lacking in Canada, which in fact it was something that we learned about from our colleagues in the UK, is the British Committee on Climate Change. And this is an arm's length group of experts that advises the British government on climate policies and the cost effectiveness and the climate effectiveness of the policies. So the Canadian government, which we've been working with on this for a couple of years, has just announced $20 million to create this new institute. And we think this is going to be a critical piece to try to depoliticize the climate debate in Canada right now and bring in some expert advice. And I'll just pass through this. Just the idea is this is really to provide expertise to the government, as I was mentioning. And then the one other big piece of this, which was missing in Canada, which there's been some progress on since last year, is the establishment of an energy data infrastructure in Canada. And as we know, when it comes to policy making, or in particularly when you look at sustainable finance and social finance, if you don't have the data, you can't make good decisions. This is another important. One of the more exciting things we've been working on, and again, this is something that's quite a bit more developed in Europe than it is in North America, but it's the idea of how do you develop transition pathways. And we're now working with a couple of academics, one in Calgary, one in Ottawa, and developing a new methodology that basically marries the traditional energy system and economic system modeling technologies with a social cultural layer. And the idea is, my simple way of describing it is that, for some people, the models are all data, no people. And for others, it's all people, no data. And so it's a bit of a divide in those who are much more around the social consensus visioning approach to pathways versus the engineering approach to pathways. And so we're basically putting those two things together and developing a new methodology that can be taken up by governments, by industry groups, by NGOs, by cities, and to really help us imagine and develop credible long-term transition pathways to a low-carbon economy. And I'll certainly be describing this a little more. And in fact, Canada is going to be hosting, for the first time outside of Europe, a major transition pathways symposium that we're going to be supporting in 2019. And then the one thing that probably keeps us awake more than anything, and that we talk about more than anything, is how do we actually communicate with people, communicate with Canadians in a way that is, is honest and genuine, but also gets at the challenge of polarization. So we're looking right now at creating a specific values-based communication platform around energy and climate, and we may also look at issue of immigration at the same time, that really calls out polarization, and so we'll see where that goes. That's very much a work in progress. And this is, again, I won't go into the details, but basically polling that has been done by a group in Canada that we've been working closely with, and really for us, the polarization around climate is, whether you think we should never build a pipeline versus whether you think we shouldn't put a price on carbon. They're two very kind of polarizing ideas, and it's interesting to see that that the sort of, for us, the point of this polling is that there's actually a fairly significant group of people in the middle that doesn't really feel strongly either way. So if you look at something like Trans Mountain Pipeline, which has tremendous media attention and political attention, only 20% of Canadians oppose it, and 80% either are in favor or don't really care. And so it's important really to understand where the country is at when you're addressing these. So moving into sustainable finance, and I've got a number of slides on this because this is probably one of our largest endeavors right now, and it in relation to social finance, sustainable finance is dealing with essentially all of the mainstream mechanisms of capital markets. So it's insurance, it's pensions, it's investments, it's asset managers, it's infrastructure, and it's really working with it's securities and all of the government regulations that dictate how our finance system operates. And so we've been spending quite a bit of time trying to figure out, given that we're in this major transition, how do we finance the transition? And social finance is going to be an important way to demonstrate new creative tools and to make sure that communities and NGOs and charities are not left out of it. And then for us, on top of that, it's how do we really bring in the massive, multi-billion dollar amounts of capital to help us with this transition. And the challenge really being trying to get the government and the financial sector to collaborate. Again, there's various different elements of this. Certainly from the philanthropic perspective, there's responsible investments. Foundations like the Ivey Foundation and many others in Canada are doing quite a bit on impact investing, ESG applied to full portfolios. I'm quite optimistic that there's been significant change in Canada just even over the last year in terms of where we're getting on this subject. So for us, it's really this, you're trying to figure out this connection between market innovation and policy leadership going up the curve. And, you start with very real projects in the economy. And I think, Jeff, you're going to certainly be talking about some of that, that, move up through the scale from actual projects and specific businesses right up to how you shift the overall macro economy. And once you get toward the top, you'll see the financial system, markets, institutions. I mean, that's the area that we are now very active in. And of course, we're all well aware, and a big part of the event that I'm at today in California is, this idea that there's a massive risk to financial stability if we don't address. I have a quote here on the 3 and 4 degree scenarios, and in addition to Thomas Buberl saying this, I was at an event last year in New York, and one of the insurance companies, it was a big global finance meeting. One of the big insurance companies said that they were modeling 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees, 6 degrees, and Jeremy Grantham was the final speaker, and he kind of looked back at the CEO of one of the major global insurance companies and said, no offense to my esteemed colleague, but there really isn't any point in modeling anything beyond 5 degrees. At that point, nothing is insurable, and that should be a pretty stark warning for anybody, given that the 3 and 4 degree scenario is where we are heading. A fair bit of information here just for people to reference, but there is a lot going on right now around the world on sustainable finance, and countries like France, in the EU, the UK, China's doing an incredible amount of work, and so we're starting to see a lot of activity going on. And for us, we're really trying to make sure that Canada is in the game on this, given how Gayle described us as one of the larger oil producers and one of the larger climate emitters. And for us, it's all about really aligning the global, aligning financial systems with climate policy. And I'm not going to run through this at all. I think there's a little bit too much information, but something people can look at. And from the perspective of the Ivey Foundation and our deliberate leadership approach, we'd been essentially advocating in Canada that we needed an expert panel on sustainable finance, similar to what they were doing in the EU and in the UK. And so we were very pleased that this spring the federal government did announce an expert panel. We've been working very closely with them. The expert panel is going to be presenting at the G7 Sustainable Finance Roundtable next week in Halifax, which I will also be participating in. And the foundation is supporting a national set of sustainable finance roundtables that'll be in 5 cities across Canada. Again, this is to bring together mainstream finance with business and some policymakers in the major cities of Canada, really to figure out where we need to get to as a country. And then finally, we've been working with a business school at Queen's University in Canada to establish a new Sustainable Finance Institute. And our hope is that the expert panel might recommend that that's something that we need in Canada, and we're excited that we will launch early in 2019. That's it for me. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing from you, Jeff.
Good morning, Tansi, Ani, bonjour. Just saying good morning from the traditional unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. And I as well have a lot of information on these slides. I'm very thankful for Bruce for setting the stage. And I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about how we've approached aspects of this. You can flip to the next slide. So just very quickly, I'm going to cover these things so that it makes sense for everybody. What we're talking about in our context is developing a community-driven outcomes contract, and exactly what that is and why we chose to do it that way. And I'll do 1 or 2 minutes on who the actors are in this, and then get in some investment details about actually the financial tool, which we'll cover in great detail in Oxford later in November. You can flip to the next slide. So Bruce and Gayle both laid out the Canadian context. There's another deep layer that involves Indigenous people in Canada, and much in partnership with the SDGs. Us as an Indigenous people look at the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a driving foundational international document, which will come up later on and talks a lot about Indigenous sovereignty. It talks about working against or working to get over structural hurdles put in place by governments and legislative barriers, and moving towards what we call a reconciliation economy, where Indigenous people are fully included and inclusive inside that. And this all matters to how things appear to interested investors in the marketplace, of which, in my opinion, now having done this for a year and a half or so, there's an extreme amount of interested investors. There are not vehicles and pathways that are open to them. And we'll talk about that in a minute. You can flip to the next slide. So just very quickly, we're an Indigenous financial intermediary created early 2017, really in a response from our community members across the country to have access to finance, which they were not able to access in what we would call mainstream society very easily. So we actually had intention to create and have created an Indigenous Impact Fund for Indigenous social enterprises, and that closes next month actually. And what happened though, as we did that, we had some pre-existing relationships and we got engaged in a social finance, or what I like to call a solutions finance issue. Very quickly, that's our management team and track record. Let's get over that fast, move to the next slide. So beyond us as the financial intermediary, the one key player is an Indigenous social enterprise in a province called Manitoba, which had been for quite a while installing low loop geothermal systems on reserve, primarily 85% in homes where people were on social assistance. And the accomplishment of installing the geothermal was they hired local folks off of social assistance, they put it in the homes, and then they reduced the energy use by at least 50%. And they have some expertise also in solar and biomass and lake bed geothermal. So this is the other entity which we are working closely with. You can flip to the next slide. So very quickly for everyone, what were we trying to solve when we originally came across this issue? We weren't as purposeful maybe as Bruce was in his introduction. We had a problem that a particular Indigenous social enterprise faced. Essentially, the government of Canada put a policy and barrier in place where they would no longer repay capital costs for these geothermal installations, although they widely benefited from them as the savings and the environmental impact, the GHG reduction. So we took a look at it through although they lobbied the government, they were unsuccessful to change the policy. We became involved in an innovation lab where we were searching for solutions at the community level. And that lasted approximately 13 months. What emerged from that very quickly was that we would take a solutions finance approach with the government of Canada. We had them at the innovation lab for a while, where we would find another way that the government of Canada would accrue the savings, and we would finance it outside the system in what was then called a government commissioned outcomes contract. You can flip to slide 2, or the second part of this. It failed. It failed, and very importantly, and this is why this is new, it failed because the government of Canada came forward after 5 or 6 months of negotiations and said, well, that really isn't our priority. Our priority is not to do geothermal in on-grid communities, it's to do it in off-grid communities. Although the on-grid community energy savings and climate savings were much larger, there was a stated policy and budget priorities by the government of Canada, so they couldn't find themselves to doing this. Working with a partner, Community Foundations of Canada, and ourselves, we did a reset. We went back to the community. We wanted to make sure what their priorities were, what they wanted going forward. And the community said, we want to do geothermal installations in our homes for people on social assistance for a variety of economic, social, and energy sovereignty reasons for Indigenous people. We then stepped back as entities and said, well, then we will find another outcomes buyer and deal with this in another way without the government. You can flip to the next slide. So basically, what is this outcomes contract? We basically had an entity that would agree to buy certain hard economic outcomes, environmental outcomes, employment outcomes, as well as a series of social outcomes that were determined by the community: family resilience, retention rates in schools, economics in community, housing resilience, housing stock resilience, for example. Those are sort of the social outcomes the community themselves identified. The Community Foundations of Canada agreed to be that outcomes buyer. So the outcomes buying opportunity for the community, it's sustainable, it's a values-driven approach. It puts both economics and social outcomes, and you can put in, we consider environmental part of the social outcomes, at the household, community, and ecosystem level, right in front and center. And why is it called a community-driven outcomes contract? Because in not any particular moment of brilliance that I had, that is what it is, very, very clearly. And we want to make sure that it's distinct from something like a social impact bond, which have a very different sort of power dynamic within them. So as Bruce has said, we feel that using solutions finance tools allows the framing of benefits and outcomes primarily determined by our communities, by the Indigenous communities. And then we help to build financial tools that meet those needs. So our starting place is generally a little bit different. And we're about protecting and restoring Mother Earth. Indigenous people have a very intimate connection to the land, and that's where our culture is centered. So this becomes a very important point of it. But we don't package this as an environmental solution per se. We package it as both an economic, social, and financial solution in general. Next slide. There's two slides here on something that I want to talk about, and mostly because Bruce raised it. I think one of the critical things that's come up is, how do you actually measure impact? And as a Indigenous financial intermediary, what we wanted to do is make sure that we centered Indigenous voice when we start looking at impact. And so we looked to the community to help us determine what they believe the impacts are, how to measure them, and using Indigenous storytelling and Indigenous culture as part of that. It's not an easy thing to do, but we cost built it into this financial tool. And as it turns out, the outcomes buyers are most interested in this process of getting to Indigenous social impact measurement. You can flip to the next slide. This is more on the same. I'll just brush by that. Next slide, please. Okay, I just want to talk very briefly about the actual contract and what it is. You can change slides, please. So I've been over this a little bit already in the introduction. So basically what we're doing here is, in an area that traditionally in Canada, Indigenous peoples have been very traditionally and still are to a large degree governed by the state, the government of Canada. And what's happened in that process, particularly for energy, is there's been no self-determination on behalf of the communities, and the government drives the outputs that it wants. It has tended to make not great long-term energy decisions. It hasn't focused on resiliency, and it hasn't focused on community well-being. So we're flipping that paradigm again. What social finance allows us to do in this context is provide flexibility and adaptability, and to look at broader social benefits. And this becomes very important when you start talking to investors about your tools. There are extreme energy savings in this model, particularly on reserve in Manitoba. And Manitoba has some of the cheapest energy costs in Canada. So if it works here, we know it's going to work anywhere and have much more extreme energy savings, cost savings across other sectors of Canada. We'll flip to the next slide. So I'm going to very much too quick, I'm sure, for everyone on the webinar, describe what this is. There's 4 key actors in our model. There is the service provider, Aki Energy. There's a series of investors. There's us, the financial intermediary, and there's the community foundations as the outcomes buyer. Those 4 entities have agreed that there's a contract which has a certain amount of outcomes in it. Half of them have been predetermined, half of them will be determined with communities as we move through it. It's essentially to raise $4.3 million Canadian to do the installation of low loop geothermal in 125 homes on reserve. Not to lose the fact, though, that this is an effort by the First Nations themselves at broader energy transformation, energy efficiency, and economic resilience on reserve. We believe if you want to get to global or country level or ecosystem level changes, you need to start community by community making changes like this. Just so everyone knows, in Manitoba and southern Saskatchewan, the 2 areas where we've done energy audits, there are about 10,000 homes in only that small area that would be appropriate for this sort of model and this sort of geothermal installation. Lucky for everyone inside this webinar, we're right in the thick of actually raising the investment pool. We have the outcomes buyer guaranteed. The investment pool, we have 3 investors in now, and will largely be done their investment committee process by the end of this December. Once again, this contract will last a 24-month period, which is rather quick in the impact investing space. It's essentially 1 year of installs with 1 year of a verification process. And then all the investors are paid out at a 4% fixed rate of return on the investment, which in most market setting situations is low. But this is also the first of its kind in Canada, and it's a demonstration project, and we don't want to inappropriately set market trends on our first one out the door. The outcomes contract, just to refresh everyone, is a result of a process when it originally failed, and then Aki, Raven, McConnell, Community Foundations of Canada, CKX, a few other players participated in an innovation lab process. It's important to note that the Indigenous communities of Fisher River, Sakin, Long Plains, and Peguis are the ones who determined their priorities and are the ones who determined that they wanted to move forward with this type of an installation. We chose the financial instrument afterwards. Next slide, please. So this is usually helpful for folks because this is a not uncomplicated model. Essentially, you have a series of investors who put money in. The financial intermediary really is the one managing a series of 3-level relationships. You have a delivery agent who has a contract to perform certain tasks. You have the target beneficiaries, the individuals, the First Nations, the homes. Once you have independent verification, agreed upon metrics, the outcomes funder agrees to pay out based on the performance of installation. So this will be a part of your slides, and folks can look at it and share it. It's a fairly easy way to understand it. Next slide, please. In investment terms, this is just a quick way to get at what I've just said. These are our headline figures. $4.3 million total project cost, 5.1 committed as outcomes buying, 4% fixed rate of return, 24 months, 125 homes. We have somewhat detailed figures on the energy impacts and the economic impacts, and an organization like Bruce is setting up in terms of the climate expertise, the energy expertise is very much needed in our space because we've had to use a variety of figures and a variety of data on the energy side itself. Next slide. So what's unique about this? And we're getting close to the end here. the first thing, and I think I've said it several times, is the process elevates the actual community's needs over the priorities of the outcomes buyers, the financial entities, or the investors. The real magic sauce in all this is the relationships that the Indigenous social enterprise Aki Energy has on the ground and the relationships the Indigenous financial intermediary brings. One thing I failed to mention, several of the investors are foundations, and this is a unique role for foundations in this. They have agreed to take any of the profits of the 4% and reinvest it into Indigenous social enterprises. And that was actually their suggestion and not ours. What it does have the ability to do, though, is put in a closed loop financial system in place. And it actually gets away from some of the negative press around social impact bonds as for-profit mechanisms. Of course, it builds Indigenous community resilience, energy security, utilizes Indigenous ways of knowing and being, about how we harvest data and talk amongst ourselves. And very importantly, it builds Indigenous financial intermediary, us as an intermediary, to lead the brokering of agreements. And on that front, since we've started to socialize the model and raise investment, we've been invited by the government of British Columbia to start an innovation lab on October the 1st with 6 First Nations and investors and others in British Columbia. And we've been invited by the government of Canada to look at an outcomes contract model on the reduction of diabetes in Indigenous communities through healthy food supports in the Prairie Province. So we're already getting take up on several other fronts. One of the things that I've tried to stress is that these instruments need to have a level of market efficiency around them in order for them to be taken to scale. We have the opportunity at least to do between 8 to 10 other social outcomes contracts we've been approached by investors to do. We also believe in part of the experience of this is that people need to get on with the doing and actually start bringing forward using solutions-based finance tools in communities. And from there, it's much more easier to on-ramp the large pools of capital that are required, the billions of dollars that are required to have widespread systemic change. And in particular, this is one way we can lever the government of Canada into the space, is to demonstrate the success of the model and not have government determine the priorities at the outset. And I think there's one last slide. I don't go into too much. I've already talked about this. This really, for us, has primed the marketplace. It's engaged impact investors. It's de-risked the process of outcomes buying by taking this approach forward. We're building expertise in the system. I've had to learn how to draft all kinds of new legal contracts and agreements in order to make it work. And it's been an interesting process. I think the financial system is generally risk averse to new things, and we need to help them overcome that perceived risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, Bruce and Jeff, for wonderful presentations. As you both said, we'll be getting into greater detail at the social finance program. Steve, I think there's some questions that have come in, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but let's see if we can handle some of those. And then I've got a few questions too, so I'll let you go forward with the question.
Okay, sure. We do have three or four questions. If anybody else in the audience would like to ask them, just a reminder, please type those into the questions panel and we'll address them as many as we have time for. First question probably addresses back to Bruce, please, which is, what have been some of the key investments to create the low carbon economy, and who have been those investors?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think in investing being sort of a big concept, I think on the philanthropic side, there have been a number of foundations working at investing in this kind of social infrastructure for the low carbon economy. And I would say in Canada, as with most things, it's really trying to kind of unlock public resources for the large investments. So like big renewable programs, feed-in tariffs. There's something like $3 or $4 billion a year spent on energy efficiency. So it's really, I would say, still being led by public dollars in coordination with things like the cap and trade and carbon tax revenues that are coming in.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. Bruce, sorry. So a question back over to Jeff. So a couple on the outcomes and the outcome bias. But for the case that you talked about there, what were the specific outcomes that the outcome buyers were purchasing?
So what they agreed to purchase, first of all, was the installation of geothermal in the 125 homes. Coupled with that is the energy reduction costs as a result of that, which is about 50%, sometimes a little bit greater than that. The third is actually on a reserve employment for people otherwise not employed with a very high skill set, a very high HVAC level skill set. So those are the hard, what we call the hard numbers for the outcomes purchasing. The other half of that is a series of social outcomes, which we are now engaged the community in a process of determining. But the outcomes buyer has agreed that they don't need to know those in advance to agree to buy it. And we have a chart of a list of what those could be. So.
Okay, thank you. So multifaceted panel, and more to come. A follow-on question from that is, how do you find outcomes buyers like that? So a question from Vishrut, who says, not all countries around the world might have outcomes buyers in that. Are you seeing foundations playing the main role of investor and outcomes buyers at this initial stage?
I mean, the logical outcomes buyer is those who are receiving the upstream benefit from it. In this case, it should be the government of Canada. They didn't come on board, so philanthropic institutions did step up in Canada and the United States to say, we're very interested in how that works and we're willing to purchase the outcomes. In an international context, I know there's others, Global Health Fund and others who are doing outcomes purchasing alongside state and country governments, and sovereign wealth funds who are also willing to do it.
Okay, great, thank you. A broader question, I guess, and I don't know if this, if you maybe want to take this one, Bruce. But the question is from Tanuja: how do you balance impact and performance? It's often been pointed out that the pursuit of financial performance can cause mission drift. How do you know that you can maintain both?
I think that's really the big question in all of this, and I think it's important to look at the continuum of opportunities that exist, where different organizations will have a different set of goals or perhaps different values around that, where some people will favor much more impact with less financial performance, and others really want to see decent financial performance along with impact, and perhaps the impact will be less significant. So I would say it's always going to be a balancing act, and it's really important for people to be making these investments within their own framework and their own understanding.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, a key question that. So Jeff, going back to your slides there, there's one of the points on one of the latter slides that was saying that the method that you're using here is utilizing some of the Indigenous storytelling kind of methods and cultural ways of knowing. Could you give us an example of what you mean by that, please?
Sure. I mean, one of the ways that you measure family resilience in Indigenous communities, although we don't use that word, maybe happiness is a better indicator. when folks are employed and when you have energy systems in a home that work for people and don't have black mold and other things like that growing and all the problems associated with it, and then the energy cost reductions. We are trying to measure, and this is according to the families, how would they understand when they're in a better situation? And in a talking circle community gathering, several of the families said we would know by the amount of laughter that our family actually that returns to our situation as a family. The interesting thing about that is, while you think it's silly, there is a significant body of research around the impacts that laughter actually has on well-being. And so through storytelling and through gathering of data through storytelling, you indicators come out of that, which we then capture, and then you can kind of quantify it after you've captured it. So hopefully it's a good example.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Gayle, do you have any more questions or comments from your side, please?
Well, I think that there are a number of, we've just finished an analysis of the development impact bonds and social success notes used by UBS. And there was a consistent theme that came out, which is how do you involve community in actually determining indicators? How do you know what success really looks like? And how do you involve community early on in the development of a development impact bond or a social impact bond? So as we think about these new tools, putting people whose lives are at the center of our decision making first becomes more critical. And what we look at social finance is what problem you're trying to solve, how are people and planet put at the center, and what are the different tools that can be used to deploy capital to positively impact those lives. And I think the way we structure social finance is it's various tools and various approaches that are being used around the world to actually create the solutions necessary to address those complex issues. What kind of leadership strategies are needed? And what's the interplay between government, private sector, philanthropy, and the people whose lives you're trying to change? And so I think it's really important to continue to emphasize new ways of looking at the problem and looking at the appropriate solutions. And I think what Jeff and what Bruce are showing us again is you've got to build different infrastructures. You need to open your mind in terms of creative ways of using capital. And that's really what we're exploring. I'm going to turn it over to you, Steve, to sort of talk about social finance and how we work, how it operates, and then say I look forward to seeing our colleagues in Oxford in November. So thank you.
Thank you, Gayle. Yeah, so thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Hopefully you found this of interest, and if so, then you should know a little bit more detail of the social finance program, which is the executive education program, which will be running in November here in Oxford in about 7 weeks' time now. So I'll just quickly run through what we look at in that program to put a little bit more context on the bones. And we'll send you these slides and also the details of the program afterwards. So the program is directed jointly by Gayle Peterson along with Alex Nichols, a professor of social entrepreneurship based here at the Skull Centre at the Business School in Oxford. Gayle has a history and specialist expertise in grant making with many foundations, and between them they have been directing the impact investing program and now the social finance program for 5 years, and developed this program, which scored our highest feedback rating for teaching last year in its first session. One of the things which we do on this program, like many of our impact and wider finance and executive programs, is to hear from professors and academics, yes, but also to hear from people who are pioneering latest activities in the field. So we'll see here a list of people, including Bruce and Jeff, who we've heard from today, alongside foundations, banks, and different initiatives from around the world. We try to get people from different continents to give us a global perspective which matches the global makeup of the class. So typically we would aim for a class of 40 people and have people from 20 different countries in a group like that. So day one on the social finance program will be really a day of definitions, building common language, and considering really the concept of scale and what we mean by going to scale at a national, international level, and examine, really what can go right, what can go wrong with things like it when you're thinking of big projects and concepts like that. We have a guest speaker, Jennifer Price, who worked with us on our webinar 2 weeks ago, who is the president of the Calvert Fund. And we will also have Oksana Oracheva, who is the general director from the Vladimir Putin Foundation from Russia, talking about examples of philanthropy and endowments and social investing from Russia. Second day, we are going into impact measurement. So we think we're doing good work. How do we prove and demonstrate that? So that will be with Professor Alex Nichols and also with Dennis Whittle, who was one of the founders of Global Giving and now the CEO and founder of Feedback Lab. So really looking at feedback strategies and how to feed back the results of that into your strategy and recalibrate that. In the afternoon, we'll move on to look at blended capital, but also in the supply chain and using technology to track key issues as we go through with Randy Newcomb, who is the president of Humanity United from the US. Day three, we start to look at public funding, so particularly the use of social impact bonds, development impact bonds, and social success notes. So again, with Professor Alex Nichols here, but also a case study from Phyllis Costanza from the UBS Optimus Foundation, who have been working with Educate Girls on one of the first international kind of social success notes and social impact bonds. So we'll be hearing about the process which has gone through. What were the objectives? What was the process? What were some of the obstacles? How they were overcome? What the results have been, and what we might do differently next time. Day four, we're really looking at the topic for today's webinar, so carbon, climate change. In the morning, we will be looking at the concept of carbon pricing and tracking with Mark Campanale from the Carbon Tracker Initiative. And then we will have Ellen Dorsey, the director of the Wallace Global Fund, talking about divest, invest strategies, particularly addressing gender. Then in the afternoon, we'll be going into the case study from today in much more detail by looking at strategies from Canada and across the wider Commonwealth for sustainable finance with Bruce Lourie and Jeff Cyr. Day five, we'll be looking at blending capital. We are looking to have the CEO from the UK office of the Queen Rania of Jordan Foundation. So he'll be talking about the developments which they're doing there to revolutionize education in Jordan and the Middle East using technology, with technology and funding underpinned for donor-advised funds from Jack Ma. And then in the afternoon, Peter Droback, who is the director of the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship based here at the Business School in Oxford, who recently joined as director there, was previously a director at Partners for Health, who were key in establishing a healthcare in Rwanda after the wars and conflict there. So again, a large scale project at a national level, and then we'll kind of close up by looking at people's networking goals, also looking at people's social finance strategy. So as we go through the week, you will work through a workbook to really kind of outline key things from each day. What is your strategy? What is your theory of change? How are you going to measure that? What are the different methods of capital which you're going to use? How are you going to blend those? We have a very diverse class. We expect to have 40 people. We're well on the way to that. We do have some spaces left. These are some of the titles and organizations from people who came last year. We're looking at senior level people, directors, partners, some private investors, VPs from banks, people from funds, but very happy to send more details of that to you afterwards. The program runs the 5th to the 9th of November. We do have half a dozen places left. If you would like to join us, you really need to think about registering by the end of this month, please, because there is some pre-work to do. And we will also be hosting a preparation session using our online virtual centre, The Hive, from Oxford about 2 weeks in advance. So we need to make sure that you can get your pre-reading, get keyed in for that, and meet the prep session. So details are on the screen. We'll also send them to you by email afterwards. Really want to wrap up by thanking Bruce Lourie from the Ivey Foundation for your time today, especially from joining West Coast where it's early morning on your visit down there at the event. Thank you to Jeff Cyr from Raven Indigenous Capital Partners over in Canada. For your time and your efforts there. Thank you, Gayle, for bringing this all together, and thank you, everybody out there, for registering and joining today. Thank you. Goodbye.